The day Stella made me eat my dinner alone in the kitchen while she served a 5-course meal to her book club friends in my own dining room, I knew something had to change. For 3 years, I'd been living in what used to be my late husband's house, watching my daughter-in-law transform from a sweet bride into someone who treated me like an unwelcome guest in my own home. But that humiliating evening, sitting on a wobbly stool with a paper plate while listening to her laugh with her friends about old people problems through the thin walls, was my breaking point. What Stella didn't know was that my husband had never legally transferred the house deed to my son Douglas before he passed away. And what she definitely didn't expect was that a quiet 67-year-old woman could make one phone call that would change everything. By the time Stella realized what I'd done, it was already too late. This is the story of how I went from being treated like a servant in my own home to reclaiming my power, my dignity, and my life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Margaret Phillips, and at 67, I thought I'd earned the right to be treated with basic respect in my own home. But for the past 3 years, since my beloved husband Harold passed away, that respect had been slowly chipped away by the one person I never expected it from, my daughter-in-law, Stella. Harold and I had been married for 42 years when a sudden heart attack took him from me. We'd built our dream home together in Oakwood Heights, a beautiful colonial with a wraparound porch and a garden that was the envy of the neighborhood. Harold had always said this house would be Douglas's someday, but in our grief after the funeral, paperwork seemed unimportant. We were all just trying to survive those first terrible months. Douglas, my only son, had married Stella just 6 months before his father died. She seemed perfect then, polite, soft-spoken, always asking if she could help with anything. She had shoulder-length auburn hair and a smile that could light up a room. I remember thinking Harold would have loved having her as a daughter-in-law for many years to come. But grief changes people, and apparently it revealed Stella's true nature. It started small. Little comments about how the house was too old-fashioned and needed updating, how my cooking was too heavy for their modern lifestyle, how my presence made it difficult for them to start their new life together. I understood they were newlyweds, so I tried to give them space. I started eating dinner earlier, spending more time in my bedroom, making myself smaller in my own home. The changes came gradually. First, Stella rearranged the living room without asking, boxing up family photos that had sat on the mantel for decades. When I gently mentioned that I missed seeing Harold's picture there, she sighed dramatically and said, "Margaret, we can't live in a museum forever. Douglas and I need to make this place feel like home, too." Then she started hosting her book club meetings monthly. 8 women would arrive with their designer handbags and expensive wine, taking over my dining room like they owned it. The first few times, Stella politely suggested I might be more comfortable watching television in my bedroom during their meetings. I complied, thinking it was temporary. But temporary became permanent, and suggestions became expectations. The breaking point came on a crisp Tuesday evening in October. I'd spent the afternoon preparing my famous pot roast, Harold's favorite recipe that I'd perfected over 4 decades of marriage. The whole house smelled like home, like the way things used to be when my family actually felt like a family. Around 5 p.m., Stella's book club friends started arriving. I heard the familiar sounds of air kisses and excited chatter as designer heels clicked across my hardwood floors. I was setting the table for 3, assuming we'd all eat together before their meeting, when Stella swept into the kitchen wearing a flowing emerald dress that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. "Oh, Margaret," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Didn't I mention? The book club is having dinner here tonight. We're discussing Eat, Pray, Love, and I thought it would be fun to do a themed meal." I looked at my pot roast, then at the elaborate spread she was preparing: quinoa salad, kale chips, some kind of grain bowl with edible flowers. Nothing that resembled actual food to my 67-year-old eyes. "That's wonderful, dear," I said carefully. Should I set places for 10 then? Stella's laugh was like wind chimes in a storm. Pretty but completely out of place. Oh no, Margaret. This is really more of a young women's gathering. You understand, right? All that talk about finding yourself and exploring new relationships? It might be a bit awkward for someone your age. The words hit me like a physical blow. Someone my age. As if reaching 67 had somehow disqualified me from having opinions about books, food, or life in general. Where exactly am I supposed to eat? I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. Well, there's plenty of your pot roast left, Stella said, already turning away from me to arrange her quinoa creation on my good china, the set Harold had given me for our 25th anniversary. You could take a plate into the kitchen, or your room, whatever feels comfortable. Comfortable. There was nothing comfortable about being banished from my own dining room like an unwanted pet. But I did it. I served myself a portion of pot roast on a paper plate. Stella had claimed all the real dishes for her themed dinner and carried it into the kitchen. I sat on the wobbly stool by the breakfast counter, the same stool I used when I was doing food prep, and listened to the sounds of laughter and conversation drifting from my dining room. They were discussing the book's themes of self-discovery and empowerment. The irony wasn't lost on me. You know what I love about this book? I heard one woman say. It's about a woman who finally stands up for herself and refuses to accept less than she deserves. Exactly. Stella's voice rang out above the others. Sometimes you have to be ruthless about cutting toxic people out of your life. People who hold you back or make you feel guilty for wanting more. Another voice chimed in. My mother-in-law is exactly like that, always trying to guilt-trip my husband about family obligations and respecting your elders. It's so manipulative. The laughter that followed felt like a knife twisting in my chest. Were they talking about me? Was I the toxic person Stella was discussing with her friends? The worst part, Stella continued, is when they act like they're doing you a favor by letting you take care of them. Like, no, Sharon, cooking your own meals and managing your own life is called being an adult. Sharon. That must be the friend with the troublesome mother-in-law. But the way Stella said it, with such venom and certainty, made me wonder if she'd rehearsed these complaints before. I sat in my kitchen, eating my pot roast off a paper plate like an unwelcome stranger, and felt something fundamental shift inside me. This wasn't my imagination or sensitivity. This was calculated cruelty, delivered with a smile and justified as necessity. When Douglas came home an hour later, he found me still sitting in the kitchen, my plate long empty, but my thoughts racing. Hey, Mom, he said, loosening his tie from his job at the accounting firm. How was your day? Fine, I managed. Stella's book club is here. He nodded absently, grabbing a beer from the refrigerator. Yeah, she mentioned that. Smells great in here. Did you make pot roast? Yes, but it's all set up for the book club dinner in the dining room. Douglas looked confused. Didn't you eat with them? The question hung in the air like smoke. How? Could I explain to my son that his wife had exiled me from my own dining room? How could I tell him that I'd been relegated to eating alone in the kitchen while strangers used my good china and discussed how burdensome mothers-in-law could be? I ate earlier, I lied. But as I watched him walk toward the dining room to greet his wife and her friends, I made a decision. I was done being small, done being grateful for scraps of respect in my own home, done pretending that this was normal or acceptable. That night, after the book club left and the house finally fell, quiet, I sat in Harold's old study and opened the file cabinet where we'd kept all our important documents. Marriage certificate, insurance papers, tax returns from decades past. And there, in a manila folder labeled House Documents, I found exactly what I was looking for. The deed to 1247 Maple Drive, Oakwood Heights, purchased by Harold and Margaret Phillips in 1981. Never transferred. Never changed, still legally mine. For the first time in 3 years, I smiled a real smile. Stella wanted to talk about self-discovery and empowerment? Well, she was about to get a masterclass. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt since Harold died. For 3 years, I'd been sleepwalking through my own life, accepting whatever scraps of dignity Stella chose to throw my way. But sitting in that kitchen like an unwanted guest had awakened something in me, something that had been dormant too long. I made my coffee in silence, listening to the sounds of Douglas and Stella getting ready upstairs. Their morning routine had become as predictable as clockwork. Stella's hairdryer running for exactly 20 minutes. Douglas rushing around looking for his keys. Both of them treating the house like a hotel where I happened to be an invisible staff member. At 7:30, sharp, Douglas appeared in the kitchen adjusting his tie. "Morning, Mom. Did you sleep okay? Did you sleep okay?" "Like a baby," I said, which wasn't entirely untrue. After finding that deed, I'd slept better than I had in months. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot. To us. Now back to the story. Stella followed a few minutes later, her auburn hair perfectly styled, wearing a cream-colored blazer that probably cost more than my monthly Social Security check. She worked as a marketing coordinator for some tech startup, a job that seemed to consist mainly of taking photos of expensive lunches and posting them on social media. "Margaret," she said without looking at me, "I need you to deep clean the dining room today. Some of the book club ladies are coming back this weekend for brunch, and I want everything spotless. Not would you mind or could you please, just a direct order, delivered while she scrolled through her phone. Actually," I said carefully, "I have some errands to run today." Both Douglas and Stella looked up, clearly surprised. In 3 years, I'd never declined one of Stella's requests. "What kind of errands?" Stella asked, her voice taking on that edge I'd learned to recognize. "Just some business to take care of downtown," I replied, keeping my voice neutral. Douglas glanced between us, sensing tension but clearly not wanting to get involved. "Well, Mom, if you need a ride, I'll take the bus," I said firmly. "I'm perfectly capable of getting around on my own." Stella's laugh was sharp. "Margaret, you haven't left this house alone in months. Are you sure you're up for navigating? Downtown by yourself?" The condescension in her voice was unmistakable. She spoke to me like I was a confused elderly woman who might wander into traffic if left unattended. "I've been navigating this city since before you were born, dear," I said. My smile sweet, but my eyes steel. "I think I can manage." For just a moment, I saw something flicker across Stella's face. Surprise, maybe even a hint of respect. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "Fine," she said, grabbing her designer purse. "Just make sure you're back. In time to clean the dining room. The brunch is important." After they left, I stood in my kitchen, in my house, and felt a surge of something I'd almost forgotten. Determination. My first stop was the law office of Patterson and Associates, where Harold and I had done our estate planning years ago. Robert Patterson had been Harold's friend since college, and I trusted him completely. "Margaret!" Robert stood up from behind his mahogany desk, his face breaking into a genuine smile. "What a wonderful surprise! How are you holding up?" "I'm doing well, Robert. Better than I have in a long time, actually." We spent a few minutes catching up, talking about his grandkids and my garden. But eventually, I got to the point. "Robert, I need to ask you about the house. Harold always said he wanted Douglas to have it someday, but I don't think we ever actually transferred the deed." Robert's expression grew serious. "You're right. Harold mentioned wanting to set up the transfer, but we never completed the paperwork. As far as the law is concerned, you're the sole owner of the property. And if I wanted to make changes to that situation?" "What kind of changes are you thinking about?" I took a deep breath. "I want to establish my legal rights. Make sure everyone understands that it's my house and I make the decisions about it." Robert studied my face carefully. "Margaret, has something happened?" You seem different than the last time I saw you. Let's just say I've remembered who I used to be before I started apologizing for taking up space in my own home." Robert nodded, slowly. "All right then. There are several things we can do. We could draft a new will that specifies your intentions, or we could look into other arrangements. But first, tell me what's really going on." So I did. I told him about the gradual erosion of my place in the house, about being made to eat in the kitchen while strangers used my dining room, about being treated like hired help rather than the woman who'd raised Douglas and built this home with Harold. Robert's expression grew darker with each detail. "Margaret, what you're describing isn't just disrespectful, it's a form of elder abuse. You have every right to live comfortably in your own home." "I don't want to make trouble for Douglas," I said quickly. "He's my son, and I love him. But I can't continue living like this." "You wouldn't be making trouble for him," Robert said firmly. "You'd be protecting yourself, and sometimes that requires making difficult decisions." We spent the next hour going over my options. Robert explained that since I was the legal owner, I had complete authority over who lived in the house and under what conditions. I could establish a rental agreement, set house rules, or even ask people to leave if necessary. "The most important thing," Robert said, "is to document everything. Make your position clear legally, so there's no confusion about your rights." I left his office with a folder full of documents and a plan that felt both terrifying and liberating. For the first time in years, I was taking control of my own life. My next stop was the bank, where I met with Linda Chen, the financial advisor Harold and I had worked with for decades. "Mrs. Phillips," Linda said warmly, "it's good to see you. How can I help you today?" "I want to understand my financial situation completely," I said. "All accounts, all assets, everything." Linda pulled up my records on her computer. "Well, you're in good shape. The house is fully paid off, worth about $850,000 in today's market. You have your savings, Harold's life insurance, and your Social Security. You're quite comfortable, actually." I felt a surge of surprise. Somehow, over the past 3 years, I'd started thinking of myself as a burden, someone who needed to be grateful for a place to live. But the numbers didn't lie. I was financially independent. "Linda," I said slowly, "if I wanted to make changes to my living situation, what would that look like financially?" "What kind of changes?" "Maybe travel. Maybe renovate the house the way I want it. Maybe make it clear that it's my house and I make the decisions about it." Linda smiled. "Mrs. Phillips, you have enough resources to do whatever makes you happy. You don't need anyone's permission to live your life." By the time I got home that afternoon, it was nearly 4 p.m. I'd expected to return to an empty house, but I could hear voices in the living room, Stella's voice and another woman's. I walked in to find Stella sitting on my couch with a woman I recognized from the book club, both of them surrounded by fabric samples and paint swatches. "Oh, Margaret," Stella said without getting up. "This is my friend Jessica. We're planning some updates to the house for the brunch this weekend. I hope you don't mind that we got started without you." Jessica, a blonde woman with perfectly veneered teeth, smiled at me condescendingly. "Stella's told me so much about you. It's sweet how you've adapted to sharing your space. Sharing my space. In my own house." "Actually," I said, setting my purse down carefully, "I do mind." Both women looked up, surprised by my tone. "I mind that you're planning changes to my house without consulting me. I mind that you're treating my home like your personal project. And I especially mind being spoken to like I'm a guest who should be grateful for accommodation." Stella's face flushed red. "Margaret, what's gotten into you? We're just trying to make the house look nice for your friends," I interrupted. "In my house, using my furniture, my dishes, my space, while I eat in the kitchen like some kind of servant." Jessica gathered up her samples quickly, clearly uncomfortable. "Maybe I should go." "That's probably best. I agreed. After Jessica left, Stella turned to me with an expression I'd never seen before. Part anger, part shock, part something that might have been fear. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" she demanded. I smiled. At her? And for the first time in 3 years, it wasn't apologetic or accommodating. "I'm remembering that this is my house," I said simply. "And I make the rules here." The silence that followed my declaration stretched between Stella and me like a taut wire, ready to snap. I watched her face cycle through emotions, confusion, disbelief, and finally, anger. "Your house?" Stella's voice was dangerously quiet. "Margaret, I think you're confused. This is Douglas's house. Our house. You live here because we allow it." The words hit exactly as she intended them to. But instead of crumbling like I had countless times before, I felt something solid and unshakable settle in my chest. "No, Stella," I said, moving to Harold's old chair, the burgundy leather recliner. She'd been trying to get me to donate to charity for months. "I think you're the one who's confused." I sat down deliberately, claiming my space in my own living room. "This house belongs to me. The deed is in my name. Harold never transferred ownership to Douglas, and I never agreed to any such transfer." Stella's perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide the shock that crossed her face. That's not possible," Douglas said. Douglas assumed. We all assumed. But assumptions aren't legal documents. She began pacing, her designer heels clicking against the hardwood floors Harold and I had refinished together 20 years ago. "Okay, fine. So technically it's your house. But Douglas is your son. Surely you wouldn't actually. What? Exercise my rights as a homeowner? Set boundaries about how I'm treated in my own home?" Stella stopped pacing and turned to face me fully. For the first time since I'd known her, the mask of false sweetness was completely gone. What I saw underneath was ugly. "Let me make something very clear, Margaret," she said, her voice dropping to a tone I'd never heard from her before. "Douglas and I have put a lot of work into this place. I've invested time, energy, and money making it suitable for our lifestyle. I've tolerated your presence because Douglas felt guilty about putting you in a home. But don't mistake tolerance for weakness." "Is that what you call it? Tolerance?" I leaned back in Harold's chair, feeling his presence supporting me. "Making me eat in the kitchen while you entertain guests in my dining room is tolerance? You're being dramatic? Am I?" I stood up slowly, drawing myself to my full height. At 67, I might not be as tall as I once was, but I still had presence when I chose to use it. "Let me tell you what I've tolerated, Stella. I've tolerated being treated like unpaid household staff. I've tolerated having my belongings moved, donated, or thrown away without consultation. I've tolerated being excluded from decisions about my own home." Stella's face was flushing red, but I wasn't finished. "I've tolerated listening to you tell your friends how burdensome mothers-in-law can be while sitting in my own kitchen eating off paper plates. I've tolerated you making me feel like a charity case in the house I've lived in for over 40 years. Douglas works 60 hours a week to support this household," Stella shot back. "We pay for groceries, utilities, maintenance. With what? Money?" I asked quietly. The question caught her off guard. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what money do you use to pay for groceries and utilities in my house? Because I've been paying those bills since Harold died. I've been covering the property taxes, the insurance, the maintenance. I've been subsidizing your lifestyle, while being made to feel grateful for the privilege." I walked to the kitchen and returned with the folder Robert Patterson had given me, along with the bank statements Linda Chen had printed out. "Would you like to see the receipts?" Stella stared at the papers like they were written in a foreign language. Douglas handles all the finances. He said you needed help with the bills. Douglas has been lying to you, dear. Or you've been lying to yourself. Either way, it stops now." That's when Douglas walked through the front door, still wearing his rumpled work clothes and carrying his briefcase. He took one look at our faces, mine calm but determined, Stella's flushed and panicked, and immediately went into peacekeeper mode. "Hey, what's going on? You two look like you're planning a war." "Your mother has lost her mind," Stella said immediately, rushing to his side. "She's claiming the house belongs to her and that we're somehow taking advantage of her." Douglas looked at me with the patient expression he'd perfected over the years, the one that said, "Mom's being difficult again, but we'll humor her." "Mom," he said gently, "what's this about?" I handed him the folder. "Look at the deed, Douglas." He opened it reluctantly, scanning the documents with the same expression he'd worn as a teenager when I'd caught him breaking curfew, hoping the problem would somehow resolve itself if he looked confused enough. "I don't understand," he said finally. "Dad always said the house would be mine someday." "Someday, yes, after I died. But that someday hasn't come yet, and I'm very much alive." Douglas sank onto the couch, still staring at the papers. "But Mom, I thought we were taking care of you." "Taking care of me?" I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Douglas, when was the last time you actually took care of me? When did you cook me a meal or ask how I was feeling or include me in a conversation about this house?" "We include. You exile me to the kitchen during dinner parties. You make decisions about renovations without consulting me. You treat me like a babysitter for your social events rather than the woman who raised you." Stella grabbed Douglas's arm. "Don't let her manipulate you with guilt. This is exactly what toxic people do. They twist everything to make themselves the victim." The word toxic hung in the air like poison gas. After 3 years of swallowing my pride, of making myself smaller, of accepting crumbs of respect in my own home, being called toxic for finally standing up for myself was the last straw. "Toxic?" I repeated slowly. "Stella, let me tell you what's toxic. Toxic is moving into someone's home and gradually erasing their presence. Toxic is making an elderly woman eat alone while you entertain guests with her dishes in her dining room. Toxic is gaslighting someone into believing they should be grateful for abuse." Douglas looked between us like a trapped animal. "Mom, please, can't we all just calm down and talk about this reasonably?" "I am being reasonable," I said. "I'm setting boundaries in my own home. That's not only reasonable, it's necessary." "What kind of boundaries?" he asked warily. I took a deep breath. This was the moment I'd been building toward, the line in the sand I'd been too afraid to draw for 3 years. "First, I eat at my dining room table for every meal, whether you have guests or not. Second, any changes to this house, decorating, renovating, even rearranging furniture, require my approval. Third, I'm not your housekeeper, your babysitter, or your emotional punching bag. I'm the homeowner, and I expect to be treated as such." Stella's voice was shrill with disbelief. "And if we don't agree to your ridiculous demands?" I looked at her steadily, feeling Harold's strength flowing through me. "Then you can find somewhere else to live." The silence that followed was deafening. Douglas's face went white and Stella looked like I'd slapped her. "Mom," Douglas said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "You can't be serious." I've never been more serious about anything in my life. Stella's shock was rapidly transforming into fury. "You bitter old woman. You can't stand seeing Douglas? Happy, can you? You can't stand that he chose me over your pathetic need for attention." "Stella," Douglas started, but I held up my hand. "Let her finish," I said calmly. "I want to hear what she really thinks. You're jealous because your son grew up and doesn't need you anymore. So you're using this house as a weapon to control us, to force us to pretend we care about your feelings. Well, I won't do it. I won't pretend that your opinions matter or that you deserve special treatment just because you're old." When she finished, breathing heavily from her outburst, I nodded thoughtfully. "Thank you for your honesty, Stella. It's refreshing to finally hear what you really think instead of that fake sweetness you've been serving me for 3 years." I turned to Douglas, who was staring at his wife like he'd never seen her before. "Now you know exactly who you married," I said quietly. "The question is, what are you going to do about it?" The 3 days that followed were the quietest my house had been since Harold died, and the most peaceful I'd felt in years. Douglas and Stella had retreated to their bedroom, like wounded animals, emerging only for hurried conversations in whispers and the occasional slam of a door. I, meanwhile, went about reclaiming my home with a systematic precision that surprised even me. The first thing I did was move Harold's picture back to the mantel where it belonged. For 3 years, it had been relegated to my bedroom dresser, because Stella thought it was morbid to have photos of dead people in common areas. As I dusted the silver frame and placed it in its rightful spot, I felt Harold's presence more strongly than I had since the funeral. "I'm sorry it took me so long," I whispered to his smiling face, "but I'm awake now." Next, I reclaimed my dining room. The formal table that had hosted Christmas dinners, birthday celebrations, and countless family meals was returned to its original configuration. Out went Stella's modern centerpiece, some twisted metal sculpture that looked like it belonged in a doctor's office, and back came my grandmother's lace tablecloth and the china cabinet Harold had built by hand. I ate my breakfast there, y'all. Next morning, using my good dishes and the sterling silver flatware Harold had given me for our 10th anniversary. The eggs tasted better off real china, and the morning light streaming through the windows felt like a blessing. On the second day, I began what I privately called the Great Reclamation. Years of accumulated resentment had taught me exactly which changes I'd hated most, and I methodically undid them all. The throw pillows Stella had scattered everywhere, gone. The scented candles that made the house smell like a department store, donated to charity. The modern art she'd hung in place of my family photos, packed away in boxes and left outside their bedroom door. The most satisfying change was in Harold's study. Stella had gradually taken it over, turning his peaceful retreat into her home office, which seemed to consist mainly of taking selfies for social media and ordering things online. I spent an entire afternoon removing her clutter and restoring the room to its original purpose, a quiet place for reading, thinking, and remembering. I found Harold's favorite books, still marked with his handwritten notes in the margins. I discovered photo albums Stella had boxed away, filled with pictures of Douglas as a baby, family vacations, and happier times. I even found love letters Harold had written me during his business trips, tied with a blue ribbon and hidden in his desk drawer. For the first time in 3 years, I cried tears of joy instead of frustration. The most remarkable change, though, was in me. Without the constant stress of walking on eggshells, of apologizing for existing, of making myself smaller to accommodate Stella's demands, I felt like I was waking up from a long, unpleasant dream. I started cooking again, really cooking, not just throwing together quick meals to avoid being in Stella's way. I made Harold's favorite recipes, filled the house with the sense of garlic and herbs and slow-simmered comfort. I baked bread from scratch, something I hadn't done since the early days of my marriage, when I had time to love the process instead of just rushing through it. I called my sister Patricia in Phoenix, something I'd been meaning to do for months, but had somehow never found the time or energy for. "Margaret?" Patricia's voice was full of surprise and delight. "My goodness, you sound different. You sound happy." "I am happy," I realized as I said it. For the first time in years, I actually am. "What's changed?" I told her everything. The years of gradual erosion, the breaking point with the book, club dinner, and my decision to reclaim my home and my life. Patricia listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "I've been worried about you," she said finally. "Ever since Harold died, you've seemed so diminished. Like you were fading away." I wanted to say something, but I didn't know how. "I was fading away," I admitted. I let myself become invisible in my own life. And now, I looked around my dining room with Harold's picture back on the mantel and my grandmother's tablecloth gleaming in the afternoon sun. Now I remember who I used to be, who I still am, underneath all the apologizing and accommodating. Patricia's voice was warm with pride. "I'm so glad you found your backbone again, Maggie. Mom would be proud." That evening, I did something I hadn't done in 3 years. I invited someone over for dinner. My neighbor Eleanor, a widow about my age who lived 2 houses down, had been trying to maintain a friendship despite Stella's obvious disapproval of old ladies gossiping. "Margaret," Eleanor's eyes widened when she saw the dining room. "You've changed everything back. It looks like you're home again." "It is my home again," I said, serving her a portion of the beef stew I'd spent all afternoon perfecting. I just had to remember that. We ate by candlelight, using my good dishes and sharing stories about our late husbands. Eleanor told me about her book club, a real one where they actually discussed books, her volunteer work at the animal shelter, and her recent trip to visit her daughter in Seattle. "You should come with me next time," she said. "Sarah would love to meet you, and Seattle is beautiful in the spring." "I'd like that," I said, surprising myself. When was the last time I'd made plans for my own enjoyment, without asking permission or worrying about inconveniencing someone else? As Eleanor was leaving, she paused at the door. "I have to ask, where are Douglas and Stella? I haven't seen them around." "They're adjusting to some new arrangements," I said diplomatically. Eleanor's eyes twinkled with understanding. "Ah, good for you." The truth was, I barely saw them either. They crept around the house like ghosts, using the back entrance to avoid the main, living areas I'd reclaimed. I could hear them whispering behind their bedroom door, and I caught glimpses of Stella on her phone, having intense conversations that stopped abruptly when she saw me. On the 3rd day, I decided to test my newfound boundaries. I prepared a proper dinner: roast chicken with herbs, mashed potatoes, green beans from my garden, and set 3 places at the dining room table. At 6 o'clock sharp, I called upstairs. "Dinner's ready?" There was a long pause, then the sound of footsteps and muffled conversation. Finally, Douglas appeared at the top of the stairs, looking haggard. "Mom, we were thinking of ordering pizza tonight." "That's fine," I said pleasantly. "You can order pizza. I made dinner and I'm eating it in the dining room. You're welcome to join me." Another pause, more whispered conversation, and then Stella's voice sharp with frustration. "This is ridiculous, Douglas. We can't keep tiptoeing around her forever." I smiled to myself. They were absolutely right. They couldn't keep tiptoeing around me forever. Eventually, they'd have to make a choice: respect my boundaries or find somewhere else to live. 20 minutes later, Douglas came downstairs alone. He stood in the doorway of the dining room, looking like a man caught between 2 opposing armies. Can I eat with you, Mom?" "Of course," I said, gesturing to his usual chair. "I'd like that." We ate in companionable silence for a few minutes. The chicken was perfectly seasoned, the potatoes were creamy, and the green beans still had just the right amount of crunch. It was a good meal, made with care and eaten with gratitude. "Mom," Douglas said finally, "I need to ask you something." I looked up from my plate, seeing my son clearly for perhaps the first time in years. He looked tired, older than his 32 years, and deeply troubled. "Go ahead." "Are you really going to make us leave?" I set down my fork and considered the question carefully. "Douglas, I'm not making you do anything. I'm simply requiring that anyone who lives in my house treat me with basic respect. If that's impossible for you and Stella, then yes, you'll need to find somewhere else to live. But we can't afford—" He stopped himself, realizing what he'd almost said. "Can't. Afford what? Your own place? On your combined salaries?" Douglas looked down at his plate. "Things are tight. Stella's student loans, the car payments, credit cards. Ah, understanding dawned. So you need to live here, not just for convenience, but for financial survival. He nodded miserably. Then I suppose you and Stella need to decide what's more important, your pride or your financial stability. That's not fair, Mom. I reached across the table and patted his hand gently. Sweetheart, for the first time in 3 years, I'm being completely fair. I'm offering you a choice with clear terms and predictable consequences. That's more fairness than I've received in this house since your father died. Douglas looked up at me, and for a moment, I saw the little boy who used to help me bake cookies and tell me about his day at school. I don't know what to do, he whispered. Yes, you do, I said gently. You've always known what the right thing to do was. You just have to decide if you're brave enough to do it. The next week brought a series of small victories that felt like major triumphs. Stella had clearly decided that if she couldn't control the house, she'd simply pretend I didn't exist. She started leaving early in the morning and coming home late at night, avoiding any chance of interaction. When she did have to be in common areas, she treated me like furniture, walking around me without acknowledgement, speaking only to Douglas as if I were invisible. Ironically, her attempts to punish me with silence were exactly what I needed to continue my reclamation project. On Monday, I tackled the kitchen. For 3 years, Stella had gradually replaced my practical cookware with trendy gadgets that looked impressive but performed poorly. Out went the expensive espresso machine that made bitter coffee, and back came my reliable old percolator. The decorative canisters filled with quinoa and chia seeds were replaced with my grandmother's glass jars containing real flour, sugar, and coffee beans. I found my cast iron skillets buried in the back of a cabinet, neglected and slightly rusty. Spending an afternoon seasoning them properly felt like a meditation. These pans had cooked thousands of meals for my family over the decades. They deserved better than abandonment. By Tuesday, I was ready for the most ambitious project yet: Harold's garden. The backyard had been Harold's pride and joy, neat rows of tomatoes, peppers, and herbs, bordered by flower beds that bloomed from spring through fall. After he died, I'd been too grief-stricken to maintain it properly, and Stella had convinced Douglas that it was too much work for someone your age. They'd hired a landscaping company to replace Harold's carefully tended vegetables with low-maintenance shrubs and decorative gravel. Standing in what used to be our garden, I felt Harold's absence like a physical ache. But beneath the sadness was something stronger: determination. It might be too late in the season to plant everything I wanted, but I could at least begin. I called the landscaping company and had them remove the gravel and unnecessary shrubs. Then I drove to the garden center, my first solo drive in over a year, and loaded my car with seeds, transplants, and supplies. The young man at the checkout looked surprised when I declined his offer to help load the bags of soil. "I've been moving dirt longer than you've been alive, young man," I said with a smile. "I think I can manage." The physical work felt wonderful. My hands remembered the rhythm of planting, the satisfaction of placing seeds in dark earth with the faith that they would grow. My back ached by evening, but it was the good ache of meaningful work, not the hollow ache of suppressed frustration. On Wednesday, Eleanor came over to help me plant herbs. We worked companionably in the afternoon sun, talking about everything and nothing. It felt like the old days, when neighbors were friends and women didn't have to apologize for taking up space. "You know," Eleanor said, wiping dirt from her hands, "I haven't seen that fancy car of Stella's in the driveway much lately." "She's been staying out more," I said diplomatically. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "Staying out or staying away?" "Both, I think." That evening, Douglas confirmed Eleanor's observation. He came home to find me reading in Harold's study, surrounded by the restored comfort of my husband's books and memories. "Mom, can we talk?" I marked my place in the novel I was reading, something I'd chosen purely for pleasure, not because it was on someone else's approved list. Of course. Douglas slumped into the chair across from me, looking exhausted. Stella's been staying at her friend Jessica's place for the past 3 nights, I noticed. She says she can't handle the toxic environment here anymore. I almost laughed at the irony. And what do you think? I think. Douglas ran his hands through his hair, a gesture he'd inherited from Harold. I think I don't know how things got so messed up. Things got messed up gradually, I said gently. One small compromise at a time, one boundary crossed after another, until we all forgot what normal looked like. Stella says you're trying to break us up. Am I? Douglas looked at me in surprise. Aren't you? Douglas, I can't break up your marriage. Only you and Stella can do that. All I've done is refuse to pretend that disrespect is acceptable in my own home. He was quiet for a long moment. She wants me to choose. Between what? Between her and you. She says if I don't stand up to you about the house rules, she'll know where my real loyalty lies. I closed my book and gave Douglas my full attention. And what did you tell her? I told her that my loyalty lies with treating people decently, regardless of who they are. For the first time in our conversation, I smiled. That sounds like something your father would have said. She didn't like that answer. I imagine not. Douglas leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. Mom, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest. Always. If I told Stella she needed to apologize to you and follow your house rules, would you be willing to start over? Give her another chance? The question hung in the air between us. It was the olive branch I'd been hoping for, the acknowledgement I'd needed from my son. But as I considered my answer, I realized something had fundamentally changed in me over the past week. Douglas, I said carefully, 3 weeks ago, I would have said yes immediately. I would have been so grateful for any acknowledgement of my feelings that I'd have accepted the first apology offered, no matter how sincere. And now? Now I understand that I don't need Stella's approval to live comfortably in my own home. An apology would be nice, but only if it represents genuine change, not just words designed to restore the old dynamic. Douglas looked confused. What kind of change? Real respect. Not the fake politeness she used to show when she wanted something, but genuine consideration for my opinions, my comfort, and my place in this family. That seems reasonable. It is reasonable. But Douglas, I need you to understand something. I'm not holding my breath waiting for it. I've discovered that I'm perfectly happy living my life according to my own values, whether Stella participates or not. This seemed to trouble him more than anything else I'd said. But what about family? What about staying together? Sweetheart, a family that requires one person to accept mistreatment for the sake of staying together isn't really together at all. It's just people occupying the same space while pretending their problems don't exist. That Thursday, Stella returned, not to apologize or negotiate, but to collect more of her belongings. I was in the kitchen preparing lunch when I heard her heels clicking across the hardwood floors upstairs, followed by the sounds of drawers opening and closing. She came downstairs carrying 2 suitcases, her face set in the expression of martyred dignity she'd perfected over the years. Douglas met her at the bottom of the stairs. So this is it? He asked quietly. This is it, Stella replied, not looking at me. I won't be manipulated or controlled by someone who's clearly lost touch with reality. I continued chopping vegetables for my salad, but I was listening to every word. Stella, Douglas said. She's my mother. And I'm your wife. Or I was, until you decided to choose her over me. I didn't choose her over you. I chose basic human decency over whatever this has become. Stella's voice turned cold. Fine. When you're tired of being controlled by a bitter old woman who can't accept that the world has moved on without her, you know where to find me. She headed for the door, then turned back. Oh, and Douglas, good luck affording this place. On your salary alone. We'll see how long your precious mother keeps you around when you can't help with the bills. The front door slammed behind her, leaving Douglas and me in heavy silence. After a few minutes, Douglas came into the kitchen. He looked like a man who'd just survived a natural disaster, shell-shocked, but somehow relieved. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said quietly. "For what?" "For letting things get so bad. For not standing up for you sooner. For choosing someone who could say those things about you." I put down my knife and turned to face him fully. "Douglas, you didn't choose someone who was secretly cruel. You chose someone who was on her best behavior, and then you both got comfortable with letting that behavior slip. It happens in a lot of relationships, but it shouldn't have happened in ours." "No," I agreed. "It shouldn't have. But it did, and now we deal with the consequences." Douglas sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd eaten off paper plates while his wife entertained her friends in my dining room. "What happens now?" he asked. I smiled at him, feeling lighter than I had in years. "Now we figure out how to be a family again. Just the two of us, if necessary. And if Stella wants to come back, then she comes back on terms that work for everyone, or she doesn't come back at all." Douglas nodded slowly. "I can live with that." "Good," I said, returning to my salad preparation, "because I'm making pot roast tonight, and for the first time, in 3 years, we're eating it in the dining room." For 2 weeks after Stella's dramatic exit, Douglas and I settled into a routine that felt both foreign and familiar. We ate dinner together most evenings, sharing stories about our days like we hadn't done since he was in high school. He helped me with some of the heavier garden work, and I cooked the meals he'd grown up loving, the ones Stella had deemed too unhealthy for their lifestyle. It should have been peaceful, but I could see the strain in Douglas's face. He was fielding daily phone calls from Stella, texts that made him frown and sigh, and pressure from her friends who'd decided I was the villain in their story. He was trying to hold his marriage together while honoring the boundaries I'd set, and the stress was wearing on him. Everything changed on a Tuesday evening when Douglas came home carrying a manila envelope and wearing an expression I'd never seen before, part confusion, part anger, and part something that looked like betrayal. "Mom," he said, setting the envelope on the kitchen counter, "we need to talk." I was seasoning a chicken for roasting, but something in his tone made me stop and give him my full attention. "What's wrong?" "I went to see our accountant today. Jerry Williams, the one who's been doing our taxes since I got married." I knew Jerry. Harold and I had used him for years before Douglas took over our family's financial planning. "Is there a problem with your taxes?" Douglas laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You could say that. Jerry asked me how you were doing, and I mentioned that you'd been having some confusion about the house ownership." My blood began to run cold. Jerry looked at me like I'd grown a second head. He said, "Confusion? Douglas, your mother's been paying the property taxes on that house for the past 5 years. She's also been covering your homeowner's insurance, and she set up an account that automatically pays your utilities." The chicken forgotten, I turned to face my son fully. The look in his eyes was unlike anything I'd ever seen from him. "Mom," Douglas said quietly, "Jerry showed me the records. For the past 3 years, the entire time Stella and I have been living here, you've been paying for everything. The mortgage was paid off years ago, but you've been covering taxes, insurance, utilities, even the landscaping service Stella hired." I felt like I'd been caught in a lie, even though I'd never actually lied about anything. "Douglas, that's not even the worst part," he continued, his voice getting stronger. "Jerry asked if I knew about the monthly transfers you've been making to my checking account. $1,500 every month for 3 years. I closed my eyes. I'd hoped he'd never have to know about that. "You've been giving me money," Douglas said, and his voice cracked. "All this time when Stella was complaining about how expensive. It was to support you when she was making you feel like a burden, when I thought I was being so responsible by taking care of my aging mother. You've been supporting us." The silence stretched between us. Outside, I could hear the evening sounds of the neighborhood, dogs barking, someone starting a lawnmower, the normal sounds of normal lives. But inside my kitchen, everything felt suspended. "Why?" Douglas whispered. "Why didn't you tell me?" Sat down at the kitchen table, suddenly feeling every one of my 67 years. "Because you needed to feel like a man taking care of his family. Because I remembered what it was like to be young and proud and struggling to make ends meet. Because I could afford it, and it made me happy to help. But Stella, the way she treated you, if she'd known, it would have been worse," I said quietly. "She would have seen me as an even bigger threat, someone trying to buy your loyalty." Douglas sank into the chair across from me, the same chair where we'd had our breakthrough conversation 2 weeks ago. But this time, he looked completely shattered. "Jesus. Mom, I let her make you eat in the kitchen. I stood by while she treated you like hired help. And the whole time, you were paying for the privilege of being abused in your own home." Douglas, no, let me finish. His voice was getting stronger, but I could hear the tremor of rage underneath. "Jerry showed me something else. Do you want to know what Stella spends that $1,500 on every month?" I wasn't sure I did, but I nodded. Shopping, restaurants, spa treatments, that book club she's so proud of. It's basically a monthly excuse to spend $200 on wine and appetizers at expensive restaurants. The business expenses for her job, designer clothes, and lunches with friends. Douglas pulled out his phone and started scrolling through something. I looked at our bank statements after talking to Jerry. In the past year alone, Stella has spent over $3,000 at high-end clothing stores, $1,500 on beauty treatments, and God knows how much on those dinner parties she throws for her friends. "Douglas, how you spend your money is between you and it's not our money," he exploded, then immediately lowered his voice. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to yell. But Mom, don't you see? She's been spending your money, the money you gave me to help with household expenses. She's been treating like her personal shopping fund." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "How much do you actually make, Douglas?" He looked embarrassed. "Enough to cover our basic expenses, but not much more. Certainly not enough to afford Stella's lifestyle. I always assumed the extra money was coming from, I don't know, bonuses or something. I never really tracked it." "And Stella's job? Part-time? Marketing coordinator. She makes maybe $800 a month, and half of that goes to her student loan payments." The numbers painted a picture I didn't want to see. For 3 years, I'd been unknowingly funding the lifestyle of a woman who treated me like dirt in my own home. My money had paid for the designer clothes Stella wore while insulting me, the expensive wine she served to friends while making me eat alone, the spa treatments that kept her looking perfect while she made me feel worthless. "There's more," Douglas said, and his voice was so quiet I almost didn't hear him. "More what?" He opened the manila envelope and pulled out a stack of papers. After I left Jerry's office, I was so angry I could barely think straight. I came home planning to call Stella and demand an explanation, but she wasn't answering her phone. So I drove to Jessica's house where she's been staying. Douglas's hands were shaking as he shuffled through the papers. She wasn't there either. Jessica said she's been staying at some guy's apartment for the past week. My heart sank. I'd suspected this might be coming, but hearing it confirmed still felt like a blow. "I'm sorry, sweetheart." "His name is Marcus," Douglas continued, his voice mechanical. "He's a real estate agent Jessica knows. Apparently, Stella's been seeing him for several months." The kitchen fell silent, except for the ticking of the old clock Harold had hung above the sink 30 years ago. "Jessica felt bad about lying to me," Douglas said. "She gave me his address. I went there." "Douglas, I didn't do anything stupid, if that's what you're worried about. I just sat in my car and watched. Stella came out around 5 o'clock, carrying a bottle of wine and looking happy, happier than I'd seen her in months. He pulled a photograph from the envelope, clearly taken from a distance, but unmistakably showing Stella embracing a tall man with dark hair outside an upscale apartment building. "I hired a private investigator," Douglas said quietly, "just to know for sure. These are his preliminary findings." I looked at the papers he'd spread on the table: bank records, credit card statements, photographs, phone records, the evidence of a double life laid out in black and white. "She's been living with him on weekends for the past 6 months," Douglas said, telling me she was having girls' nights or visiting her sister. "She's been using credit cards I didn't know about. Cards that, according to this, are paid off every month from our joint account. Our joint account that I'd been funding with my monthly transfers." "Douglas," I said carefully, "what are you going to do with this information?" He looked at me with eyes that seemed to have aged 10 years in one afternoon. "I don't know. Part of me wants to confront her, to demand an explanation. Part of me wants to just disappear." "And the other part?" "The other part is so angry, I can barely see straight. Not just about the cheating, Mom, about everything. About how she treated you while spending your money. About how I let it happen. About how stupid I've been." I reached across the table and took his hand. "You weren't stupid. You were trusting. There's a difference." "Is there?" "Because right now it feels like the same thing." We sat in silence for a few minutes, surrounded by the evidence of Stella's betrayal. Finally, Douglas spoke again. "I know what Dad would have done." "What's that?" "He would have protected you. He never would have let anyone treat you the way I let Stella treat you. Your father never had to face this situation. But if he had, he would have chosen you. Every time. Without question." Douglas gathered up the papers and photos, sliding them back into the envelope. "Well, it's time I started making the same choice." "What does that mean?" He looked at me with a resolve I hadn't seen since he was a teenager determined to learn to drive stick shift. "It means Stella made her decision when she moved in with another man. Now I get to make mine." "And what decision is that?" "To stop being the kind of man who lets his mother pay for his cheating wife's lifestyle while that wife makes her eat alone in the kitchen." For the first time since he'd walked in with that envelope, I smiled. "I think your father would be proud of that decision." "I hope so," Douglas said. "Because I'm about to burn some bridges, and I want to make sure I'm burning the right ones." Next morning, I woke to the sound of Douglas on the phone in Harold's study, his voice crisp and businesslike in a way I hadn't heard since his father died. Through the thin walls, I could catch fragments of conversation. Immediately, breach of trust, and no longer negotiable. I made coffee and breakfast for 2, setting the table in my reclaimed dining room with the good china Harold had given me for our anniversary. Whatever Douglas was planning, he'd need a proper meal to face it. He appeared in the doorway at 8 a.m. sharp, wearing his best suit and carrying a briefcase I hadn't seen him use in years. But more than his appearance, it was his posture that caught my attention, straight-backed, purposeful, and utterly determined. "Good morning, Mom," he said, kissing my cheek before sitting down. "Thank you for breakfast." "You're welcome." "Big day ahead?" "The biggest." He cut into his eggs with surgical precision. "I've been up since 5 making phone calls. Lawyers, accountants, the bank, even called my boss to let him know I might need some time off." "Time off for what?" Douglas looked up from his plate, and I saw Harold in his eyes, the same steel-gray determination my husband had shown when facing difficult business decisions. "Time off to handle my divorce properly, and to make sure Stella understands exactly what kind of mistake she's made." After breakfast, Douglas outlined his plan with the methodical precision of a military strategist. He'd already retained Robert Patterson, the same lawyer who'd helped me understand my property rights, to handle the divorce proceedings. He'd frozen their joint accounts and credit cards to prevent Stella from making any more unauthorized purchases. Most importantly, he'd prepared what he called the documentation. What kind of documentation? Every receipt, every bank statement, every credit card charge for the past 3 years. Robert's team spent all night putting together a complete financial picture of our marriage. Douglas's smile was sharp as a blade. Turns out, when you're spending someone else's money on an extramarital affair, it leaves quite a paper trail. And the private investigator? Still working, but he's already got enough evidence to prove adultery, which in this state means Stella gets nothing in the divorce. No alimony, no property settlement, nothing. I set down my coffee cup carefully. Douglas, are you sure you want to be so aggressive about this? Mom, she spent 3 years making you feel like a burden while living off your generosity. She made you eat alone in your own kitchen while entertaining her friends with your money. She's been cheating on me for months, possibly longer. His voice grew colder with each word. Aggressive doesn't begin to cover what she deserves. At 10 a.m., Douglas's phone rang. The caller ID showed Stella's name. Perfect timing, he said, answering on speaker. Hello, Stella? Douglas? Stella's voice was sharp with anxiety. What the hell did you do? My credit cards aren't working, and I can't access our bank account. That's because those accounts are frozen pending our divorce proceedings. The silence on the other end stretched for nearly 10 seconds. Divorce proceedings? Stella's voice went up an octave. What are you talking about? We had a fight, Douglas. Married people fight. That doesn't mean... Married people fight, Douglas agreed calmly. But married people don't usually have affairs with real estate agents named Marcus. Another silence. Longer this time. I don't know what you think you know, Stella said finally. But I know you've been living with him on weekends for 6 months. I know you told me you were visiting your sister when you were actually spending nights at his apartment. I know you've been using credit cards I didn't know about to fund your double life. Douglas, let me explain. I'm not finished. His voice could have cut glass. I also know that for the past 3 years, my mother has been giving us $1,500 a month to help with household expenses. Money that you've been spending on designer clothes, spa treatments, and expensive dinners while making her feel like a charity case in her own home. I didn't know. You didn't know that the woman you made eat off paper plates in the kitchen was funding your lifestyle? You didn't know that every time you complained about the burden of supporting her, you were actually living off her generosity? I could hear Stella breathing heavily through the phone, the sound of someone realizing their world was crumbling. Where are you calling from, Stella? Douglas asked conversationally. I'm at Jessica's. No, you're not. I called Jessica this morning. She said you moved out last week to live with your boyfriend. The pretense finally cracked. Douglas, please. Can we just talk about this like adults? We are talking like adults. I'm talking like an adult who's discovered his wife is a liar, a cheater, and a financial parasite. You're talking like someone who got caught. I want to come home. I want to work this out. Douglas looked at me across the table, his eyebrows raised in question. I shook my head firmly. You can't come home, Stella. This isn't your home. It never was. It's my mother's house, and you're no longer welcome here. You can't keep me out of my own house. It's not your house, Douglas said patiently. It never was your house. The deed is in my mother's name, and she's made it very clear that you're not welcome. This is ridiculous. Margaret, I know you're listening. You can't seriously be okay with breaking up your son's marriage over a few misunderstandings. I leaned toward the phone. Stella, the only misunderstanding was mine. I misunderstood your character completely. What's that supposed to mean? It means I thought you were a young woman who made some poor choices under pressure. Now I realize you're someone who planned and executed a systematic campaign of emotional abuse while stealing from your victim. Stealing? I never stole anything. You stole my dignity, I said quietly. You stole my place in my own home. You stole my son's respect for me. And yes, you stole my money. Money I gave freely to help my family, which you spent on yourself, while making me feel worthless. Douglas took back the phone. Stella, my lawyer will be in touch about the divorce proceedings. Don't try to come to the house. I've changed the locks. Don't try to access any joint accounts. They're frozen. And don't try to contact my mother again. She's been through enough. Douglas, wait. He hung up. We sat in silence for a moment, listening to the grandfather clock tick in the hallway. How do you feel? I asked. Lighter, Douglas said, surprising me. I feel lighter than I have in years. That afternoon, Douglas drove me to Robert Patterson's office, where we spent 2 hours going over the legal implications of everything that had happened. Robert was thorough, professional, and increasingly outraged as the full scope of Stella's behavior became clear. Margaret, he said finally, you'd have grounds for a civil suit against Stella for financial fraud. The money she spent while deceiving you about the household finances could be considered theft by deception. I don't want to sue her, I said. I just want her out of my life. Understood. But Douglas, for the divorce proceedings, this information is invaluable. Stella will be hard-pressed to claim any marital assets when she's been systematically defrauding the family. On the drive home, Douglas was quieter, more thoughtful. Mom, he said as we pulled into our driveway, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. Always. Are you disappointed in me? For letting things get so bad? For not seeing what was happening? For choosing Stella in the first place? I considered the question carefully. I'm disappointed that it took so long for you to see the truth, but I'm not disappointed in you. You're a good man who tried to make a bad marriage work. That speaks well of your character, even if it wasn't the right choice. And now? Now you're making the right choice. That also speaks well of your character. Douglas nodded slowly. I keep thinking about Dad, about what he would say about all this. Your father would say that a man protects his family from people who want to hurt them, even if one of those people is his wife. Is that what I'm doing? Protecting my family? I looked at my son, really looked at him, and saw the man Harold had raised, the boy who used to help me weed the garden and listen to my stories about the old days. Yes, I said firmly. That's exactly what you're doing. That evening, we cooked dinner together for the first time since he was in high school. Douglas made his father's famous garlic bread while I prepared Harold's favorite pasta sauce. We ate in the dining room, using my good china, talking about everything except Stella. As we were cleaning up, Douglas paused with a dish towel in his hands. Mom, I have one more thing to tell you. What's that? I called the bank this afternoon and stopped the automatic transfers to my account. No more $1,500 a month. Douglas, if you need help with expenses, I don't. I've been living beyond my means because Stella expected a lifestyle I couldn't afford. Without her spending habits, I can cover my own bills just fine. Are you sure? He smiled at me, and for the first time in 3 years, it reached his eyes. I'm sure. It's time I started taking care of myself instead of expecting my mother to fund my mistakes. What about the house? The utilities and taxes? Those are yours to handle as you see fit. It's your house, Mom. I'm just grateful you're letting me live in it while I figure out my next steps. I hugged him then, feeling proud and sad and hopeful all at once. My little boy was finally becoming the man his father had raised him to be. Harold would be so proud of you, I whispered. I hope so, Douglas said, hugging me back. Because I've got a lot of making up to do. The consequences of Douglas's actions rippled outward faster than either of us had anticipated. Within 48 hours of his phone call with Stella, our quiet suburban street became the center of a drama that would be talked about in the neighborhood for years to come. It started on Thursday morning when I was watering my newly planted herb garden. A sleek black BMW pulled up to the curb, and Stella emerged wearing what looked like the same clothes she'd worn the day before, wrinkled designer jeans and a silk blouse that had clearly been slept in. Her usually perfect hair was pulled back, in a messy ponytail, and even from across the yard, I could see the dark circles under her eyes. She marched up to the front door and began pounding on it with her fist. Douglas! Douglas, I know you're in there! We need to talk! I continued watering my basil plants, watching from the corner of my eye as she tried the door handle, then moved to peer through the front windows. "Margaret!" she called when she spotted me. "Tell Douglas I'm here. This is ridiculous. We're married." "Douglas left for work an hour ago," I called back calmly, just like he does every weekday. Stella stalked across the lawn toward me, her heels sinking into the soft earth. Harold, and I had spent decades nurturing. Where is he working now? He won't answer his phone, and his office said he took personal leave. "I imagine he's meeting with lawyers," I said, moving to water the tomatoes Douglas had helped me plant. Divorce proceedings require quite a bit of paperwork. "Divorce?" Stella's voice cracked. "He can't be serious about that. We had a fight, that's all. Married couples work through their problems." I turned to look at her fully for the first time. The polished, confident woman who had made my life miserable for 3 years was gone. In her place stood someone who looked desperate, exhausted, and more than a little frantic. "Stella," I said gently, "adultery isn't a fight, it's a choice. You made your choice, and now Douglas is making his. That's not, Marcus and I are just friends." "Friends who live together?" Her face flushed red. "You don't understand. My marriage to Douglas, it's been difficult. He's never here. He doesn't appreciate me, and living with you has been—" She stopped herself, but the damage was done. "Has been what, dear?" "Challenging," she finished weakly. I smiled at her with genuine pity. "Stella, I've been paying for your lifestyle for 3 years. Your spa treatments, your designer clothes, your expensive dinners with friends, all of it funded by the woman you found so challenging to live with." The color drained from her face. "That's not— Douglas never told me." Douglas didn't know. I was helping my son support his family, never imagining that his wife was spending that money while treating me like hired help in my own home. Stella's BMW sat running in the street, expensive gasoline burning while she stood in my garden having a breakdown. "You have to understand. I never meant for things to go this far. Marcus was he was there when I needed someone to talk to." "About what?" "About how trapped I felt. About how this house felt like a museum. About how you were always there, always watching, always making me feel like I wasn't good enough." The irony was stunning. "You felt watched and judged? You felt like you weren't good enough?" "Yes. You had all these opinions about how things should be done, about the food I cooked, about the way I decorated. I felt like I could never measure up to your standards." I set down my watering can and looked at her. Really looked at her, perhaps. For the first time since she'd married my son. "Stella, I never criticized your cooking or your decorating. What I objected to was being treated like a stranger in my own home. What I found difficult was being made to eat alone while you entertained guests in my dining room. But you never said anything. I said plenty. You just never listened." That afternoon, the drama escalated when Marcus himself appeared at my door. He was younger than I'd expected, probably in his early 30s, with the kind of aggressive confidence that comes from selling overpriced real estate to wealthy clients. "Mrs. Phillips?" He extended his hand with practiced charm. "I'm Marcus Rivera. I think we need to talk." I didn't take his hand. "About what, Mr. Rivera?" "About Stella, and about this situation that's gotten out of hand." "I'm not sure what situation you're referring to." Marcus shifted uncomfortably, his salesman's smile wavering. "Look, I know this is awkward, but she's not handling this well. She's been staying with me for the past week, and she's basically having a breakdown. I'm sorry to hear that. The thing is, she can't afford to live on her own. Her job barely covers her student loans, and now with the divorce and the frozen accounts—" He spread his hands helplessly. "She needs somewhere to go." The audacity took my breath away. "Mr. Rivera, are you asking me to take back the woman who's been having an affair with you?" "I'm asking you to consider the human element here. Yes, Mistakes were made, but Stella's not a bad person. She's just lost. Lost enough to spend 3 years emotionally abusing her husband's mother while living off that mother's money? Marcus's facade cracked slightly. She told me about the money situation. She says it was a misunderstanding. What kind of misunderstanding? She thought Douglas was supporting the household. She didn't know you were contributing. So ignorance of the source makes the abuse acceptable? That's not what I meant. Mr. Rivera, I interrupted. Let me be very clear. Stella made her choices. She chose to treat me with contempt in my own home. She chose to have an affair with you. She chose to leave her marriage for what she thought would be a better situation. Those choices have consequences. But she has nowhere else to go. That's not my problem to solve. Marcus's professional mask slipped entirely. Look, lady, I never signed up to be someone's sugar daddy. Stella led me to believe she had money, that she was financially independent. Now I find out she's broke, getting divorced, and expecting me to support her. And that's my concern because you're family. You're supposed to help family members when they're in trouble. I almost laughed. Mr. Rivera, the woman upstairs, isn't family anymore. She stopped being family the moment she chose you over her marriage. And she certainly stopped being family when she made me eat alone in my kitchen while entertaining her friends in my dining room. After Marcus left, looking frustrated and overwhelmed, I called Douglas at Robert Patterson's office. How are the divorce proceedings going? I asked, smoothly. Stella's lawyer is already trying to negotiate a settlement, but Robert says we hold all the cards. The adultery evidence is ironclad, and the financial records show a clear pattern of deception. And how are you holding up? Douglas was quiet for a moment. Better than I expected. It's like, I don't know, like I've been holding my breath for 3 years and I can finally exhale. Your friend Marcus stopped by this afternoon. Marcus? What did he want? I told him about the conversation, about Stella's apparent breakdown and Marcus's request for me to take her back. Jesus, Douglas said when I finished. He actually asked you to take her back? He did. Apparently, Stella's financial situation isn't as rosy as she led him to believe. That's not surprising. Stella's never lived within her means. Even when we were dating, she was always short on rent money or asking me to pay for dinners. Douglas, do you ever wonder if she married you for financial security rather than love? The question hung in the air for a long moment. Honestly, Mom, after everything that's happened, I think she married me because I was safe, stable. The kind of guy who would take care of her while she figured out what she really wanted. And what she really wanted was Marcus? What she really wanted was someone exciting who would make her feel special. Marcus was just the first guy who fit that description and showed interest. That evening, Douglas came home with Chinese takeout and a bottle of wine, the first alcohol I'd seen him bring into the house since Stella had declared that wine should only be consumed with appropriate meals. What are we celebrating? I asked as he opened the bottle. Our freedom, he said, pouring 2 glasses. And the fact that Stella's lawyer called this afternoon to discuss settlement terms. Already? Apparently she's in more trouble than we thought. Marcus isn't the first affair. There were at least 2 others over the past 2 years. Her lawyer is advising her to accept whatever terms we offer and avoid a lengthy court battle. We sat in my dining room, eating lo mein off my good china and toasting to new beginnings. For the first time in years, the house felt like home. Douglas, I said as we were finishing dinner, I have a confession to make. What's that? I'm not sorry this happened. I'm not sorry your marriage is ending, and I'm not sorry Stella's life is falling apart. Douglas considered this seriously. You know what, Mom? Neither am I. That probably makes us terrible people. Or, I said, raising my wine glass, it makes us people who finally learn to value ourselves enough to reject abuse. I'll drink to that. Outside, the neighborhood was settling into its evening routine. Families eating dinner together, couples walking their dogs. the normal rhythms of normal lives. But inside my house, Douglas and I were celebrating the end of an abnormal situation and the beginning of something much healthier. Tomorrow would bring more legal paperwork, more difficult conversations, and probably more dramatic appearances from Stella or Marcus. But tonight, we were exactly where we belonged. In my dining room, eating a good meal, planning a better future. 2 weeks later, just as Douglas and I had settled into a comfortable routine of shared meals and quiet evenings, Stella launched what I can only describe as a full-scale campaign to salvage her situation. It began with a letter, handwritten on expensive stationery that probably cost more than my weekly grocery budget, slipped under our front door while we were at the farmer's market. "Dear Margaret," it began, in Stella's carefully practiced penmanship. "I know I've made mistakes, and I know you have every right to be angry with me. But I'm writing to you as one woman to another, hoping you might find it in your heart to forgive me." Douglas read over my shoulder as I continued through 3 pages of carefully crafted apologies, explanations, and promises. Stella claimed she'd been struggling with depression and had made poor choices while feeling isolated and misunderstood. She insisted that her relationship with Marcus had been emotional support during a difficult time, rather than a physical affair, and that she'd never intended to hurt anyone. Most manipulatively, she appealed to my maternal instincts. "I know you love Douglas and want him to be happy. We had 3 good years together before things went wrong. Don't you think our marriage deserves a chance to heal?" "What do you think?" Douglas asked when I finished reading. "I think she's desperate," I said, folding the letter carefully. "And I think she's underestimated both of us if she believes pretty words can undo 3 years of calculated cruelty." The letter was just the opening salvo. Over the next week, Stella employed every weapon in her arsenal. She sent flowers, expensive arrangements delivered daily, with cards bearing messages like, "Forgiveness is the key to healing," and "Family should always come first." She called during dinner hours, timing her calls for when she knew we'd be eating together, hoping to disrupt our newfound peace. When Douglas stopped answering her calls, she began showing up in person. Not at the house, she'd apparently learned that lesson, but at strategic locations where she knew we'd see her. The grocery store where I'd shopped for 40 years, the bank where Harold and I had done business since our wedding, even the small cafe where Douglas and I had started meeting for lunch on Saturdays. Each appearance was carefully choreographed. Stella would look appropriately contrite, wearing simple clothes instead of her usual designer outfits, her hair pulled back in, a modest style that made her look younger and more vulnerable. She'd approach cautiously, as if afraid we might flee, and always began with some variation of, "I just want to talk." "Please," she said one afternoon when we encountered her outside the hardware store where Douglas had been helping me choose paint colors for the guest bedroom. "5 minutes, that's all I'm asking." Douglas stepped protectively in front of me. "Stella, we've been through this. There's nothing to discuss." "There's everything to discuss." Her voice rose, drawing stares from other customers. 3 years of marriage can't just be thrown away over a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" I stepped around Douglas to face her directly. "Stella, which part was the misunderstanding? The part where you made me eat alone while you entertained guests in my dining room? The part where you spent my money on your affairs? Or the part where you moved in with another man?" "I never spent your money on affairs," she said quickly. "That's not what happened." "Then explain what did happen." "What did happen?" Stella glanced around nervously, clearly uncomfortable with the public nature of our conversation. "Can we please go somewhere private? This is embarrassing." "You should have thought about embarrassment before you decided to ambush us in a parking lot," Douglas said coldly. "Fine." Stella's composure cracked slightly. "You want to do this here? Fine. Yes, I made mistakes. Yes, I hurt people. But I was unhappy, Douglas. I felt trapped and alone and like nothing I did was ever good enough. So you decided to have affairs? I decided to find someone who made me feel valued. Someone who didn't expect me to compete with his dead father's ghost or his saintly mother's impossible standards. The words hung in the air like poison. Several people had stopped to listen, and I could see Douglas's face reddening with embarrassment and anger. "That's what you really think, isn't it?" he said quietly. "That this is about you not measuring up to my parents? Isn't it? Your mother never liked me, never accepted me. She made it clear from day one that I wasn't good enough for her precious son." I felt something cold settle in my chest, not anger, but a kind of sad clarity. "Stella, I never said you weren't good enough for Douglas. What I objected to was being treated like a servant in my own home. There's a difference. You criticized everything I did? I asked to eat at my own dining room table. I asked not to have my belongings thrown away without consultation. I asked to be treated with basic respect in the house I own. If you consider those criticisms, then perhaps the problem isn't with my standards." Stella's eyes filled with tears. Whether genuine or calculated, I couldn't tell. "Margaret, please. I know I handled things badly, but I was young and scared, and trying to figure out how to be a wife and daughter-in-law at the same time. You were 28 when you married Douglas," I said gently. "Not 18. Old enough to know that kindness costs nothing and cruelty has consequences. But people can change. I can change. If you just give me another chance." "Stella," Douglas interrupted, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "You've had 3 years of chances. Every time Mom tried to set a boundary, you had a chance to respect it. Every time she asked for basic consideration, you had a chance to show kindness. You chose differently every single time. That's not fair. What's not fair is expecting the woman you abused to rescue you from the consequences of your choices." That evening, Stella's campaign reached its crescendo. Douglas and I were settling in to watch an old movie when the doorbell rang. Through the front window, I could see not just Stella, but a small group of people on my front porch. Douglas opened the door to find Stella flanked by her parents, her sister, and 2 women I recognized from her book club. "Mrs. Phillips," Stella's mother began before Douglas could speak, "we need to talk to you about this situation." "What situation is that, Mrs. Chen?" "This divorce nonsense. Stella's told us what's been happening, and frankly, we're shocked by your behavior." I felt Douglas tense beside me, but I placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Please, come in. Let's discuss this properly." We moved to the living room, my living room, with Harold's picture back on the mantel and my furniture arranged, the way I preferred it. Stella's support group arranged themselves like a tribunal, with Stella herself sitting in the center, looking appropriately tragic. Mrs. Chen spoke first. "Mrs. Phillips, Stella has explained how you've been manipulating Douglas against her, using your ownership of this house as a weapon to break up their marriage. Is that what she told you? She told us that you've been making unreasonable demands, creating impossible living conditions, and now you're encouraging Douglas to divorce her over minor disagreements." I looked at each face in turn, people who clearly cared about Stella, but had only heard her version of events. "Did Stella tell you that I've been paying for her lifestyle for 3 years? That every spa treatment, every designer outfit, every expensive dinner with friends was funded by the woman she made eat alone? In the kitchen?" Stella's sister shifted uncomfortably. She mentioned there were some financial misunderstandings. "Did she mention the affairs? Plural?" The room fell silent. "Did she tell you about Marcus? About the other men she's been seeing while married to my son?" Stella's mother looked shocked. "Stella, you didn't tell us about other men." "There weren't other men," Stella said quickly. "Not the way she's making it sound. Marcus and I are friends. Friends who live together," Douglas said quietly. "Friends who share a bed. Friends who've been carrying on a relationship for over 6 months while she was married to me." The support group began to fracture. Stella's book club friends exchanged uncomfortable glances, and her sister looked like she wanted to disappear into the furniture. Even if that's true, Mrs. Chen said desperately, marriage is about forgiveness, about working through problems, together. You're absolutely right, I agreed. Marriage is about working through problems together, but it's also about respect, honesty, and basic human decency. Stella has shown none of those qualities. People make mistakes. Mrs. Chen, I interrupted gently, what would you do if someone moved into your home and gradually made you feel unwelcome there? What would you do if they spent your money while making you feel like a burden? What would you do if they cheated on your son repeatedly and then demanded forgiveness because they were unhappy? Stella's mother opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again. I'll tell you what I did, I continued. I endured it for 3 years because I loved my son and wanted his marriage to work. I made myself smaller and smaller until I almost disappeared entirely. And then one day I remembered that I'm a human being deserving of respect, and I decided to stop accepting abuse. One by one, Stella's supporters found reasons to leave. The book club friends remembered other obligations. Her sister suddenly needed to get home to her own family. Even her parents, after a few more half-hearted attempts to negotiate, finally gave up. Stella was left alone on my couch, tears streaming down her face, her carefully orchestrated intervention in ruins. This isn't over, she said quietly as she prepared to leave. I won't just disappear because it's convenient for you. No one's asking you to disappear, Stella, I replied. We're asking you to accept responsibility for your choices and move on with your life. You've destroyed my marriage. You destroyed your marriage. I just refuse to help you hide the damage. After she left, Douglas and I sat in our living room, emotionally drained but oddly peaceful. Do you think she'll keep trying? He asked. Probably. But each attempt will be weaker than the last. Eventually, she'll realize that the energy she's spending trying to undo her mistakes would be better spent learning from them. And if she doesn't realize that? I smiled at my son, feeling proud of the man he'd become. Then that's her choice to make. We can't save people from themselves, Douglas. We can only decide what we're willing to accept in our own lives. What are you willing to accept? Respect? Honesty? Kindness? The same things I should have insisted on from the beginning. And what you're not willing to accept? Everything else. 6 months later, I stood in my kitchen, truly my kitchen now, preparing Thanksgiving dinner for the first time in 4 years. The house was filled with the scents of sage and roasted turkey, the sound of laughter from the dining room, and the warmth of genuine family gathering around my table. Douglas had invited Patricia and her husband Mike from Phoenix, along with their 2 grown daughters and their families. Eleanor from next door had joined us, along with her daughter Sarah, who was visiting from Seattle. Even Robert Patterson and his wife had stopped by for dessert, celebrating not just the holiday, but the successful conclusion of Douglas's divorce proceedings. The final decree had been signed 3 weeks ago. Stella received nothing, no alimony, no property settlement, no ongoing financial support. The judge had been particularly unsympathetic when presented with evidence of her multiple affairs and financial deception. She'd left the courthouse that day with exactly what she'd brought to the marriage: debt, designer clothes, and a trail of burned bridges. Mom, Douglas called from the dining room. Patricia wants to see Harold's study. She says you've done amazing things with it. I smiled, wiping my hands on the apron Patricia had brought me from Arizona. A cheerful yellow thing decorated with cactus flowers that Harold would have loved. The study had indeed been transformed, but not back to exactly the way Harold had left it. Instead, I'd created something new. Part office for my own projects, part library for my growing collection of books, and part shrine to the memories that mattered most. Harold's picture still held the place of honor on the desk, but now it was surrounded by photos spanning our entire life together. Wedding pictures, Douglas as a baby, family vacations, and quiet moments of everyday happiness. I'd framed some of the love letters I'd found in his desk drawer, creating a small gallery of our romance that made me smile every time I saw it. "The transformation is remarkable," Patricia said when I joined her in the study. "You look like yourself again, Maggie. Really yourself." She was right. Somewhere over the past months, I'd rediscovered the woman I'd been before I started apologizing for existing. My hair was still silver, but I'd had it cut in a more flattering style. I'd bought clothes that I actually liked instead of whatever was practical and unobtrusive. Most importantly, I'd stopped walking through my own house like I was afraid someone might notice me. "I feel like myself again," I admitted, "for the first time in years." "And Douglas?" We both looked toward the dining room, where Douglas was, showing Sarah's children how to make proper gravy, his sleeves rolled up and his face animated with the joy of teaching. "Douglas is becoming the man his father raised him to be," I said. "The man he was before he got lost trying to save a marriage. That was never savable." After dinner, as our guests were preparing to leave, Eleanor pulled me aside in the kitchen. "I have something to tell you," she said, her eyes twinkling with mischief. "I saw Stella last week." My hands stilled on the dish I was drying. "Oh?" "She was at the grocery store, arguing with the manager about returning a cart full of items. Without receipts. She looked—" Eleanor paused, searching for the right words. "She looked like someone who's been living beyond her means for too long and finally hit the wall." "How so?" "Cheap clothes trying to look expensive. Hair that needed professional attention but was clearly done at home. And she was driving a beat-up Honda instead of that BMW. I felt a flicker of something that might have been sympathy, but it passed quickly. I hope she's learned something from her experiences." "Do you really?" I considered the question honestly. I hope she's learned that actions have consequences. Whether that makes her a better person or just a more careful one, that's up to her. After everyone left, Douglas and I settled in the living room with cups of coffee and slices of the pumpkin pie Patricia had insisted on making from scratch. "Good day," Douglas said, stretching out in Harold's old chair, the chair he'd reclaimed over the past months as he'd grown more comfortable. In his own skin, "The best," I agreed. "Your father would have loved seeing the house full of family again." "He would have been proud of you, Mom. The way you handled everything, the way you stood up for yourself, the way you didn't let bitterness consume you. And he would have been proud of you, too, for choosing what was right over what was easy." Douglas nodded thoughtfully. "I've been thinking about that a lot lately, about the difference between keeping the peace and actually having peace." "What's the difference?" "Keeping the peace means everyone pretends the problems don't exist. Having peace means the problems are actually solved." I smiled at him. "That's very wise. I learned it from watching you. For 3 years, you kept the peace by making yourself smaller and smaller. But you didn't have peace until you decided to solve the actual problem." The conversation was interrupted by Douglas's phone buzzing with a text message. He glanced at it and his expression darkened slightly. "Stella?" I asked. He nodded. "She wants to know if she can pick up some belongings she left behind." "What belongings?" "I have no idea. She took everything when she moved out with Marcus." "What are you going to tell her?" Douglas deleted the message without responding. "Nothing. I'm going to tell her nothing, because we have nothing left to say to each other." "And how does that feel?" "Like freedom." That evening, I did something I hadn't done since Harold died. I called my old friend Susan, who'd moved to Florida 3 years ago, and we talked for 2 hours about everything and nothing. About books we'd read, places we wanted to visit, recipes we'd discovered, and the simple pleasure of having time to appreciate life again. "You sound different, Margaret," Susan said near the end of our conversation. "You sound, I don't know, alive again." "I am alive again. For a while there, I was just existing. What changed?" I remembered that I have choices, that I don't have to accept mistreatment just because someone calls it family obligation, that my comfort and happiness matter too. What's next for you? I looked around my living room, my space, decorated according to my preferences, filled with the things that brought me joy. I'm thinking about travel, maybe taking some classes. Patricia mentioned a pottery studio near her house in Phoenix that offers week-long retreats. You should do it. I think I will. After we hung up, I made myself a cup of tea and sat in my favorite chair, reading a book I'd chosen purely because the cover appealed to me. The house was quiet but not empty. It was full of the contentment that comes from living authentically. Around 10 p.m., Douglas came downstairs in his pajamas, looking like the boy I'd raised rather than the stressed man I'd watched struggle for years. Mom, I wanted to thank you. For what? For not taking the easy way out, for not accepting Stella back just to keep the family together, for showing me that I deserved better than what I was settling for. You don't need to thank me for that. Yes, I do. Because if you hadn't stood up for yourself, I never would have learned to stand up for myself. Douglas sat down across from me, and for a moment, we just enjoyed the peaceful silence of our home. I've been thinking about getting my own place, he said eventually. Not because I don't love living here, but because I want to prove to myself that I can. I think that's a wonderful idea. Would you be okay on your own? I looked around my living room, thinking about the garden I'd restored, the friends I'd reconnected with, the independence I'd reclaimed. Douglas, I said with complete certainty, I'm going to be more than okay. I'm going to be exactly who I was meant to be. And for the first time in years, that felt like the most natural thing in the world. 3 months later, I received an invitation that made me laugh out loud. Eleanor's book club, the real one where they actually discussed books, wanted to know if I'd like to join them. Their next selection was Eat, Pray, Love. I accepted immediately. After all, I'd already lived through my own version of that story. I'd found myself, claimed my power, and learned to love the life I'd chosen. And unlike Stella's book club, where I'd once been made to feel unwelcome, this one served dinner at a proper table where everyone was invited to sit. Some stories, I realized, have the exact ending they deserve. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.